nobody wants to work anymore, apparently. BS, but I like the not-so-subtle sarcasm in the title of the video.
It's a classic gripe of out-of-touch corporate executives hiring minimum wage workers, or the trust fund baby who is angry that their gym is busy in the middle of the day. Nobody wants to work anymore. Now, I really hate to say this, but by looking at the numbers, they might have a point. Labor force participation is approaching generational lows even after the pandemic, while labor force participation amongst men specifically is the lowest it has ever been. These declines have been happening at the same time that unemployment is theoretically quite low, which, if the economists are to be believed, means it should be easy for people who want to get a job, right?
It's almost like those statistics are kind of BS.
Well, not quite. And these numbers are confusing at best, or downright misleading at worst.
Is people just don't want to go to work.
There was a poll I read a long time ago. Only like 18% of Americans feel engaged when they're at work.
I hate my job!
The signs are everywhere. Businesses, especially restaurants, need employees and they need them now.
Dude, less than 20% of the country likes their fucking job.
Yeah, so everybody's been saying nobody wants to work anymore for decades and generations because that's what they always say. It's not something new. And of course, nobody wants to work, but like people work because they have to. And when you see a bunch of places putting up hiring signs, they're probably offering something that nobody really wants, like pay that won't cover your basic expenses. So it makes more sense to continue to look for a job elsewhere.
Okay, so there are two general schools that people fall into when they see that nobody wants to work anymore. The first group are wealthy executives, business owners, or just people who have always worked incredibly hard who don't like that jobs are going unfilled. So they blame it on lazy young people who would rather sit around all day smoking cones and watching skibbity toilets. The second school of thought agrees that yes, people don't want to work. They don't want to work demeaning jobs where they won't get paid enough to support a decent quality of life.
Exactly.
It's nice when two groups who are so different can agree on something. So really, the only thing left is to work out why people don't want to work. Now, in most cases, the jobs that nobody wants to work fall into one of three categories. The first are jobs that are just paying well below market rates given the experience or the location required. Businesses aren't going to be able to fill a full-stack senior development role in Silicon Valley for $50,000 a year plus equity in their questionable pre-seed startup. But there are still plenty that try.
Especially because the average salary for somebody like that is more like $150,000. So if you're paying a third of what most other people pay, nobody's going to take that job.
Even entry-level jobs that pay minimum wage in very high cost of living areas are going to be much harder to fill in a city where even finance bros are living in shared housing. Now, hot take alert. But just like there are no shortage of crappy businesses and managers that expect to pay workers nothing for world-class skills and experience, there are lots of workers who expect world-class pay with little or no marketable expertise. One of the most insightful pieces of data on this issue is this recent survey right here. It asked a selection of Americans what they considered to be the minimum salary they would need to be financially successful. Now, most of the responses to these numbers have been laughing at the Gen Zs just entering the workforce who think that almost $600,000 a year is a realistic salary goal. Because for most people, it just isn't. Unless you are in.
So that number is so inflated by social media. Like everybody has this idea of, oh, well, I can't afford all the ridiculous stuff I see on YouTube or Facebook or whatever anybody's trying to pretend like they have on Instagram unless I can make that kind of money. So therefore, that must be what people make, right? No, it's all BS. It's all fake. But a certain generation or a lot of people don't quite realize it.
In a few very specific career paths, there are basically no jobs that pay this money. And even then, you need an insane amount of luck to get those opportunities. Now, you can blame this on young people who don't really know how the world works yet, or social media that makes it look like every hustle bro is flying private. But
Exactly.
It's all distracting from a more interesting data point. The average boomer thinks financial success is achieved with a salary of just under $100,000. According to the Bureau of Labor
Which is also not true anymore because inflation.
Statistics, this is still almost double the median national salary. But in most major cities where people can actually find jobs that pay this much, $100,000 certainly doesn't afford a lifestyle of financial success. There is simply a massive gap in expectations between the generations looking for their first jobs and the group responsible for giving out most of the jobs, so they both agree that nobody wants to work, just for different reasons. The second type of job that nobody wants to work are in workplaces that push their staff, demand unreasonable overtime, or have management that are needlessly abusive. This happens in a shocking amount of businesses across the country, and even if you are lucky enough to avoid a boss that thinks shouting is an effective motivation tool, you have probably worked some overtime out of fear of losing your job or being reprimanded. According to a 2023 workplace survey, the average full-time worker across the country studied is now putting in an average of 9.2 hours of unpaid overtime. These jobs often don't have much trouble finding people to start, but they do struggle with high staff turnover. The third are
It's very rare that I'm ever willing to work incredible overtime on a regular basis without being compensated for it. There's been plenty of jobs where I know there's a big project or something like that, and I say, all right, yeah, I'll put in the extra time, make sure this gets done. That's my job. But once it becomes the standard, you need more people or you need to pay me more.
simply jobs that never actually existed. You probably all know about ghost jobs by now, but even if you really do want to work, there is a good chance that most of your applications are just going to build out a workforce database, not to actually be considered for employment. Now, whatever the specific—
This is so frustrating, as I've been in the position where I've been hunting for jobs, and I feel like most of it just goes into the ether. Most of it just goes out into the abyss because nobody's actually searching. They just like to make their company look good by saying that they're hiring, when in actuality, they're never going to fill that position by anybody real.
reason, the results are the same. Less people end up working. But aside from settling some beef between entitled Zoomers and some out-of-touch boomers, this data all reveals something more concerning about work in the current economy. It's not that people don't want to work anymore. They simply can't afford to. So it's time to learn how money works to find out what's really behind the worst phrase in the workplace. This week's video is sponsored by MyHeritage. Ever wondered what remarkable stories are hidden in your family history? MyHeritage makes my heritage smile come up into historical your and governs a platform to uncover to work because they couldn't hire someone with 20 years of experience on a programming language that has only been out for 5 years for $15 an hour.
I have literally been asked that question as a software engineer. I was asked, hey, how much experience do you have with this piece of technology? And I got into that tech the year it came out. They said, we were looking for somebody with 2 to 3 years more experience than that. And I immediately responded with, well, good luck, because the only people you will find are the people that created it at that point, because it only came out that year. And they just kind of seemed puzzled, realized their mistake, and they said, well, I guess that's what we needed, right? But whoever wrote the job description just didn't know any better.
There are also people who don't want to work because they think unless they are offered 6 figures in their first role out of high school, it's not worth their time, and they would be better off sitting at home working on their NFT dropshipping business. Both of these groups definitely exist in shockingly large numbers, but even though it's really fun to make fun of both sides, it distracts from the much more important reason why labor force participation is getting worse. Well, as you might have been able to guess, this trend is really being driven by specific age groups and specific locations. If you look at labor force participation and exclude the youngest generation of workers and the oldest generation of workers, it's actually approaching all-time highs, which really makes sense when you think about it. It's common for both men and women to work full-time these days, and for most households, it's simply a financial necessity. So yeah, even if people don't want to work anymore, they kind of are stuck doing it anyway. The reason labor force participation has fallen off in general, though, is because the average is being dragged down by a lot of young workers and old workers. The old workers are the easiest to explain. As people started living longer, retirement ages were pushed back, and more of the population began working in non-physical jobs. As a result, a larger share of the population over 55 remained in the workforce. This has started to reverse, though, as self-funded retirement systems and general asset prices have allowed a lot of over 55s to step back from the labor force, especially after COVID, as a lot of people received severance packages and decided that an early retirement was better than going back to the office. labor force participation from young people just entering the workforce either out of high school or college is also pulling down the average, just for different reasons. More people than ever are getting a college degree, which means they are starting to work later, and fewer people are working part-time jobs while they study because for many, it's simply not worth it given how much debt they are going to be in when they graduate anyway.
Despite the fact that you're required an insane amount of previous work experience for your very first job.
This might not also be a shock to you, but it's getting really damn hard to find a job out of college. A few months ago, a post from a professor at Berkeley made the rounds after it spoke about his top students from a top college struggling to find work in technology, an industry that was hiring highly intelligent graduates like this as fast as they could make them just 24 months ago. Previously, a Berkeley CS graduate, even if not a top student, would receive multiple appealing job offers in terms of work type, location, salary, and employer. However, outstanding students, like those with a 4.0 in major GPA, are now contacting me worried because they have zero offers. I suspect this trend is irreversible and likely part of the broader trend impacting almost every employment sector.
It's also a big deal in the computer science sector because boot camps are a thing, and it's much easier and cheaper to hire a boot camp graduate because they didn't spend all that money on a college degree. So they don't expect as much money, or they don't need as much money because they're not covering insane student loans. And if a company can get them and get very similar work, why would they bother paying more for almost the same thing?
It's pretty grim stuff coming out of one of the best schools in the country. It might not be the most logical thing to do, but a common reaction from people who can't land a job with a degree they got to make them more employable is to just go get another degree. The rate of master's and PhD recipients has grown even faster than people getting an undergraduate degree.
It became like a trend in my generation of, all right, I guess I'll go to law school. And there was like this insane overabundance of lawyers, which was crazy.
Because that's now normal to stand out in a highly competitive job market. And to be honest, it's a nice way for people to avoid the reality of the job market for another few years. Spending another 2 to 8 years at college to get advanced degrees means people aren't in the labor force, which pulls down the average to look worse than it really is. So those are the ages that are perpetuating this dumb myth. But this trend is also highly dependent on location. And to see that, you need to go to the place where apparently the absolute least amount of people want to work.
West Virginia?
Yes, the Rust Belt state has the lowest labor force participation in the country, but also some of the most unusual statistical anomalies. The state is quite poor after its major industries like coal mining and manufacturing were either outsourced or simply fell out of widespread use. This means that a lot of areas have effectively been left behind with no major employment opportunities, meaning that labor force participation is much lower than the national average. But strangely, in some areas, the participation rate is much higher than what would be expected. A recent study conducted by economists from Hamline University, Cornell, and Virginia Tech found that depending on the county, labor force participation in West Virginia ranges from 42% to 77%, a gap between regions of 35%, while the average across the US states is just 17%, less than half of West Virginia. It's not unusual that cities and working towns will have higher labor force participation than other areas, because people often specifically move to these locations just to get work. But
it puts everybody in the position where if you're in an area like that, if you want a decent job, you're just kind of expected to move because factories close down and manufacturing isn't there anymore, or coal mining isn't a thing. And some people just don't want to move. And so they'll just say, all right, well, guess I'm not working anymore. It's cheap to live in random middle of nowhere West Virginia anyways. I don't need that much.
This variance was startling and uncovered a bigger national trend. The people in areas that still had work can't afford not to work, and the people in areas with no work couldn't afford to move to areas with work since it could mean giving up family support networks or simply paying for the cost to relocate housing. A lot of people who had the financial means have already moved out of the state, only making this problem worse, as they take business opportunities and money away with them. It's a dense read because it's an academic paper. It's for nerds. But if you ever feel compelled to say that nobody wants to work anymore, I definitely suggest you have a look at it. The report itself also looks at welfare issues specific to West Virginia. But just because the state is experiencing this problem the worst doesn't mean that it's in any way just something hurting them. The trend of a few concentrated cities doing extremely well while everywhere else stagnates can make nationwide figures look good. But it also means people who want to work have an option of trying their luck for one of the few jobs left in areas with fewer opportunities, or living in an extremely expensive city to compete with everybody else fighting over a spot in the few places left where people can reliably get ahead. Finance and tech have become one of the last escape ropes for people to make a deal with the devil to get out of these areas with little to no opportunities.
And tech is a rough industry to be in right now. I see so many layoffs and so many people just trying to get the same jobs. It's a tough industry right now.
I'm going to be writing an article about how even that career path is becoming impossible in my completely free email newsletter. So sign up if you are interested in reading that and other articles that will never be made into videos here. Thanks for watching, and thanks again to MyHeritage for making—
Yeah, nobody wants to work. It's BS. It's really just amplifying statistics in a way that feeds a narrative that isn't really there. But at the same time, people are in some tough situations, and people are going to school way longer for way more degrees than they should be, when they should probably focus more on just getting that first job.